Hey everybody, John Bass. I'm the founder and CEO of Hashed Health. Hashed Health is a innovation firm focused on solving unmet needs in the healthcare industry using blockchain as kind of the digital infrastructure upon which we build solutions. We focus on a bunch of different things. We are most known for 3 products that are coming out. One is a product or a new business actually that was announced a few months ago called ProCredX. It is a blockchain-based licensure and credentialing application for physicians. So for you financial services people, it's almost like KYC for clinicians and physicians, which solves kind of a big problem and drives a lot of costs in healthcare today. The second is a project that we just announced on Epicenter the other day called Bramble. Bramble is a decentralized healthcare services marketplace where credentialed providers can basically create a non-fungible token that's a service-backed asset and sell that on a decentralized exchange to consumers. And basically it's trying to create a rational, transparent, open marketplace for healthcare digital assets and services to be transacted between people who provide them and people who consume them. And then the third is a contracting engine that basically deals with value-based payments and kind of attestation-based settlements and dynamic pricing models and all kinds of different interesting healthcare-specific contracting functions. I've got a background in a series of healthcare technology startups dating back to the dot-com days. So I've kind of made a career out of shared operating systems in healthcare. And so I think a lot of that's been in revenue cycle and supply chain and value-based payments. And we built one of the first patient portals at one of the companies that I started up. So I have a lot of experience in kind of the legacy infrastructure and how it slows down kind of our attempts to fix healthcare problems and drive down this cost. We are kind of approaching a big-time financial crisis in healthcare as we approach 20% of GDP, and by 2023, I think it's going to be like $5.7 trillion. It's just out of control. And so all of a sudden, we've got blockchain. It's kind of a great hope to help us solve some of these legacy problems that we deal with today.
All right, hey guys, I'm Evin McMullen. I head up product and operations for Linnia, which is a team at Consensus. We are an Ethereum-based protocol, and we are helping to build out the ecosystem along with other teams at Consensus as well as outside of the organization. So what does being a protocol mean in Web3, right? You know, the stack is still evolving. We don't have a full understanding of what identity means or what storage will look like for our data. So we envision our place in the stack between those two sides. The instance where a user would interact on the app level with our identity and storage and third-party requests for user data. So if we think about the way that our data exists today, and we walk around all day producing data about our location, who we're talking to, what we're buying, what we're shopping for, and those different expressions of our digital selves get sucked into various disparate silos: Google, Facebook, Amazon, Target, you name it. There is no way for us as individuals to collect the data about ourselves and engage with it in aggregate, and then control who has access to what subsets of that data. Right? And we, as individuals creating the data that describes us, that is about us, are best positioned to own and control that data, which we do not today. And so in respect to healthcare, what we're really excited about at Linnia is this prospect of individuals owning and controlling the complete picture of their digital health. And if we think about it, health is not what happens when you go to the doctor's office. And that's largely what we'll talk about today, are these instances of intervention. You get a procedure done, you go in to see a specialist, you go for a teeth cleaning, whatever. But health is really what happens to us on a daily basis, and we have no way to aggregate data about our experiences that lead up to these needs for intervention. And so if we look at the blockchain as a solution for individuals not only to have autonomy over their data, but also to aggregate their data longitudinally and get a more complete picture of their experiences and their physical state, then we will be able to perform a lot of computation, derive a lot of results that are just impossible today for consumers.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Treshock. I'm part of IBM's blockchain team. I'm one of the leaders, and I focus on blockchain for healthcare and life sciences. And I'm very excited to be here today, one, because I love to talk about blockchain and its applications and how it can change the world, but also because I went to school here. And I love coming back to Penn, although I'm surprised that they still let me on campus. That'd be the story for later. So one of the things, when we talk to clients, when I talk to clients or companies about blockchain, we always talk about it in connection with other technologies. So it's blockchain and IoT, the Internet of Things, and predictive analytics, and how those three things together can really transform much of what we think of as healthcare today. But those things are the thing that gets us to the thing, to quote from Halt and Catch Fire briefly. So in our space, in healthcare and life sciences, it's the stuff coming around the corner, the stuff that's just now escaping from the lab, where the real change is going to come. So by that I mean things like quantum computing and its ability to impact drug design and human trial modeling, additive manufacturing and its ability to completely upend the pharmaceutical supply chain, and CRISPR, the gene editing technology, which is frankly my last and only hope to regrow a full head of long, fluffy hair. Those things are all set up and made possible in a commercial sense, we think, at IBM by blockchain. Right? So blockchain is the thing that gets us to the thing. And I'm pretty excited about the future and what this could all look like, and very optimistic about our ability to get there. But also, there's a lot of work involved. There's a lot of hard work involved. And this will be a great panel. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you all. So obviously, there is a lot happening. Healthcare is a very expansive space. I mentioned earlier when I introduced the panel that there's consolidation as well as fragmentation, and those two things seem at odds, but it's not if you think about some of the news that's happening with the larger entities of CVS and Aetna and Roche buying Flatiron. I think there's a lot of reasons that people are expanding across the value chain, but there's also a lot of people entering into the space, given that it is about digital health in some ways. It's about electronification. So given it's an expansive space, and we can't necessarily solve the entirety of one's longitudinal health just yet from embryonic stages to death, where do we see blockchain use cases really starting to gain hold, because either the pain points it solves are so great, or the application of the technology is just so apparent?
I think it's early days, and and having been focusing on healthcare blockchain use cases for almost 2 years now, as a startup, the whole key is what's going to drive meaningful value in the shortest amount of time. I mean, there's no shortage of use cases, right? Use cases are everywhere in healthcare. There's trust and transparency and incentive alignment issues in every value chain you can imagine. Pharma, med surg, supply chain, clinical trials, revenue cycle. I mean, pick your use case. There's a million of them. But which ones are going to move fastest? And what's really hard, what I don't think a lot of people understand, is it's this sweet spot between blockchain and a technology, an innovative business model, and a network governance structure. And so you gotta find where those things intersect, and that's the use case. And then you gotta look at the environment that you're implementing into. It's gotta drive some value. It's gotta not have a lot of competitive pressures where people are gonna want to stop it. You can't deal with PHI because blockchain and PHI don't really work together yet. So you take all these use cases that, my head's full of them, and I'm sure a lot of y'all's heads are full of them too. And then you got to start narrowing those things down. I think you got to nerd out on blockchain and healthcare for a while in order to find the ones that you think are going to move quick. And an example is ProCredX. I think licensure and credentialing of physicians kind of meets that criteria and has the potential to really solve a real problem for real companies in the next 12, 18 months, while longitudinal health records, as much as I love that use case, and everywhere I go around the world, people love that use case, but it's just going to take a while.
Yeah. What is the problem with that ProCredit sells specifically?
It takes 4 to 6 months to credential a new physician, and meanwhile you're losing about $7,500 per day on revenue, lost revenue as that unfolds. And so if we can shorten that time period by creating a better, faster, cheaper way of getting credentialing and licensure data from people who have it to people who need it through a new technical and business model, then we've solved the problem.
Yep.
So I would say that, and John, as you noted, the use cases are virtually infinite. We can all think of ways to improve, efficiency or revenue or, patient autonomy using blockchain technologies. The question is exactly as you noted, what is the context into which we would be introducing these solutions? And so I kind of see two camps of use cases. On the one hand, there are the finite, bounded instances where you are sort of modularly replacing a single process. And those are often uniquely well suited to private chain solutions, but if we sort of pursue that route wholesale, then we're just going to end up with a siloed landscape of little modular processes being replaced by private chain solutions. And to really derive the full benefit of blockchain's capacity, we need to have broader use cases as well. And those are the broad protocols, like Linnia, what we're doing at Linnia, that will allow for these sort of blue sky solutions like longitudinal health records, like individuals aggregating their data over time, not only from their health, but also facets of their life that can impact their health, such as their location, driving, stress levels. And so I think it's sort of a combination of these solutions. At first, it's a question of, can there be modular, small-scale solutions that address a very specific problem to gain trust in the market? Because that's a significant hurdle, right? Is getting sort of the institutional decision makers to recognize that blockchain is more than just CryptoKitties and Bitcoin, right? That there is an underlying technology that facilitates a lot of things we can't do today.
So we see a couple trends that impact the industry's willingness or appetite to move forward on use cases. The first is regulation. If there's some sort of regulatory pressure that keeps the industry moving, that has a profound influence on what use cases they're willing to look at. So in the life sciences supply chain, for example, track and trace of pharmaceuticals. So around the DSCSA, Drug Supply Chain Security Act, or using blockchain to track opioids to help mitigate the supply chain side of the opioid crisis. Because there is a regulatory current moving all of that downstream, the industry is willing to look at and now needs to look at solutions for those problems because they don't have them today. And then the other pressure that we see, which is what you mentioned, which is the massive restructuring that's just unfolding, with existing entrants mashing up and combining in unpredictable ways and new entrants coming in. This sort of change in corporate control creates the environment to look at this. So an example there, we now have more joint ventures between providers and payers. So think of them as two sides of the same coin, the health insurance company and the hospital or the doctor. You bring them together in a joint venture, for example, and now you have a lot of really useful data. So things, what enables that, blockchain could help unlock that, and where we've seen a lot of success is in something like patient consent, using blockchain as the engine of consent to unlock that data and help flatten some of these processes.
And one other comment is the macro level trends are also very much, I think, in our favor. The cost of healthcare today is unsustainable, and there are not a lot of good options on the table. And so all of a sudden, kind of blockchain comes along, and the trust in incumbents is a huge driver. The health insurance companies are like the least trusted companies in the world. And it's like 10% would recommend, it's ridiculous. And at the same time, they're making record profits, and things are consolidating. And there was a JAMA article that came out yesterday around the cost of interacting with an insurance company is $23 billion, and that's independent of the price of the procedure. Tons of cost, very little trust in the incumbents. It creates this kind of recipe for a thirst for change. And I think that's why you see these Amazon, Hathaway, all these big announcements are happening, and there's this real driver for change out there. And I think blockchain is coming along at an amazing time.
Yeah, and so, there has been plays at this before by some of the big digital guys, right? So I think Microsoft and Google who have come at it and have tried to push value-based payments or value-based healthcare and other ways that I think get at some of the key use cases we were talking today. What makes Web3 different? And is it just the blockchain technology, or is it a confluence of the things, as you mentioned, Mark, around the blockchain and so what are the confluence of the technology pieces or parts of the stack that perhaps make Web3 a little bit different?
It's a combination of things. So the first is that blockchain itself is different, right? So think about blockchain, what it is, what it does. It enables adversaries or competitors to achieve some level of trust across a network using computation, right? So whereas Google and Microsoft and Apple have gone at this before, and other entities have gone at this before, they were all fundamentally about centralization, right? They would centralize, they would integrate point-to-point integrations with everyone, and therefore they would solve the problem. But they themselves, not them specifically, but centralization is itself the problem, because that creates another entity that you have to trust, even if you are in some way adversarial to that entity. Blockchain helps us flatten that out and distribute trust and manage it digitally. So I think there is something fundamentally different about this technology that at least gives it a chance, a fighting chance, right, to take hold. And that coupled with what you mentioned around the cost structure now is just, it's unsustainable. And where we see, small footholds taking place. So for example, nothing to do with healthcare, but we use blockchain for accounts payable, something really plain vanilla. For big companies, big consumer products companies, and we reduce the cost per invoice, the cost to process an invoice by 40%. This is for a giant company around the mature process. Imagine if we deployed that across the back office of the world, right? How much of work is spent just reconciling disputes? In healthcare, wouldn't we rather take that money and deploy it to discovering new drugs, for buying equipment, or treating patients? So just the economics of it, if we get a little bit, if we could tip it over a little bit, right, we'll start the cascade where those companies that adopt it become more financially viable, and that'll encourage the rest of them to do so.
I would say that, you mentioned value-based payments, and something that Evin and I talked about a lot last night is the reason bundle payments, let's just take bundle payments, for example. The reason bundle payments haven't scaled are because of trust and transparency and incentive alignment issues. It's not that
when you say bundle payments, what?
Bundle payments are where you're trying to bring together a single reimbursement process for an episode of care. So for a knee replacement, it's the surgeon and their fees, and the manufacturer's implant, the device, and the prehabilitation, and the anesthesiologist and the radiologist, and the acute care hospital fees, and the post-acute rehabilitation fees. All of those people currently work on top of a claims rail, and it's purely transaction-based. So what the ACA tried to do was wrap that into a bundled payment where it's one price for that episode, set to a benchmark, geographic benchmark, and if you come in and the total cost of that episode is below that benchmark, then there's some sharing that happens back to the participants, the providers in that episode. So it's a great idea, and it basically aligns the cost and quality. It's Michael Porter's value-based care in a nutshell, right? It creates a relationship between cost and quality. But the problem is there's trust issues amongst all the participants in that bundle, so they all work independently and they don't trust each other. The reimbursement happens a year retrospectively, so the incentive blows up. Even if you get a couple $100, it was a year ago, and the administrative burden in making that year reconciliation happen it almost outweighs the value that's created. And so it's a good idea that doesn't scale. And so, blockchain's purpose-built to solve these problems, right? So we create a shared ledger that solves the trust problem, and we can start to tie together attestations of behavior and compliance to the protocol so that the patient's got some skin in the game, and you can watch value, the wallet kind of increase and decrease in value based off of that patient's adherence to the protocol. There are these neat visions about how you could restructure and fix the fundamental issues that a claims infrastructure and fee-for-service and fiat currencies, and replace that with a programmable value transfer system on top of a shared ledger. That, to me, makes a lot of sense. It's complicated, and there's ways that we need to start down that road, but I say all that because that's an example of how we can start to use the blockchain and these concepts like shared ledgers and programmable value transfer to basically create a whole new economy purpose-built for value. And that's never existed before. And so I think that's a neat story that will unfold over the next few years at Hashed and amongst a lot of other people who are working on some of these projects.
I think I want to talk a little bit about the regulatory side because we're dealing with people's lives and very sensitive information. And there was if for those of you who are in this room for the previous panel, there was a discussion around ICOs, and there was a lot of questions around regulatory implications on whether a token is a utility or security, whatnot. As we think about healthcare, and I think you've talked about, the Drug Supply Security Act. There's ACA that you brought up, and there's a fundamental idea that this space, particularly around sensitive information and health treatment of individuals, the regulations will have some role. Is there something that says within the regulatory framework of the current healthcare system that needs to change, or that you're starting to have conversations with legislators or regulators on?
I think what we're trying to do for now is operate within the constraints of the existing system. I think to bet a company's future or a use case on changing regulation for a startup is a pretty daunting task. So we got to work with what we got. And the Tennessee legislature has come to me with this question. They're trying to catch up with Wyoming and everybody else and try to be a business-friendly environment. And they're like, what can we do to support you and to help? And I just don't have time for it. I've got to figure out how to make this stuff work now. And so ask me that question in a year, and I'll probably give you a better answer. I just think we have to solve real problems in today's environment in order to prove the tech, and then incrementally start figuring out what's next.
And there's enough to do within the current constraint of things to be effective at doing a lot of stuff.
I would agree. I think that the current constraints that impact the health space are workable. Certainly not a complete greenfield like you would find in other countries. I explored developing pilot projects in Saudi Arabia where there is no HIPAA, and sort of dictate from the Ministry of Health means go forth. And so when it comes to testing whether a technical piece of the stack works, sandboxes in places like Saudi that don't necessarily have the same regulatory thicket can be really beneficial. However, as an indicator market of whether something will scale in the United States, of course, it's not going to provide us with useful outcomes. So, from our team's perspective, we're very much in the same boat. We're not going to try to push for regulatory reform around smart contracts that we haven't written yet. But there's plenty of space for us to play within the current bounds, and HIPAA is really the most influential when it comes to personal health data, and that just demands end-to-end encryption that you can prove. Which, data encryption, that's something we can handle. Like blind computation, encrypted search, we're still working on it. So we really haven't hit the guardrails where regulation will inhibit our ability to progress.
We found that like you're saying, companies in healthcare and life sciences in particular, because it's so regulated, companies were reluctant to really explore use cases in advance of the regulation. So what we at IBM started to do was do blockchain projects with the regulators. So we have two that come to mind. We did one with the FDA around using blockchain for patient consent to share highly sensitive data. We have another one with the CDC about using blockchain basically to integrate data sharing among EMRs. Right? So both of these projects now are wrapping up the first phase. Both, I think I could say, without controversy, are very successful. So our hope in this, our design is that by including the regulators, these two regulatory agencies, will and are coming out and either just speaking about the success of the project and giving a tacit endorsement of the technology, or hopefully, giving an actual endorsement of using blockchain to solve some of these problems. Like to say, I'll flip to the supply chain example. If the FDA were to say, they haven't yet, but if they were to say that the government considers blockchain an acceptable solution to solve the DSCSA mandate, right? That's kind of what we're working towards. And we think that, and again, they haven't said that yet, so I don't want to misstate anything. But that would open up a floodgate of activity.
Good. I do want to open it up for questions to the group. Does anyone want to go first and be that? Yes, gentleman in the back.
Curious, from a broad perspective in the long term, in the healthcare industry specifically, do you see blockchain as more of a sustaining technology, as in one that makes existing processes more efficient, like some of the ones that you guys were talking about, or do you see it as more of a disruptive technology that really reshapes and changes the business model and shape of the market generally?
I think that it really serves both. So, as much as I would love to wake up tomorrow to a completely decentralized world where centralized authorities just, cease to exist, and that's no longer an issue that that Cambridge Analytica can own in the headlines. There is going to be an onboarding process. We have to build the technology, we have to make sure it works, and we have to find ways to transition the world that we live in today onto a system that is powered by these new creations. And so, in that way, blockchain has to be an enabler of greater efficiency of the infrastructure and processes that exist today. However, in the healthcare space, especially when you look at patient care, blockchain technology can enable us to do things that we cannot today. So for example, if you as an individual have a longitudinal record of your data, or even you have 5 or 6 connected devices, or maybe even like 2 connected devices that are collecting relevant information about your health and well-being on a regular basis, let's say for 3 months. Say you've got type 2 diabetes, you've got a couple connected devices that are collecting information on your activity, and then maybe some basic blood levels, A1C, HDL. And then we've got, let's say 50 of you. So we've got a picture for 3 months of how diabetes expresses itself in 50 individuals. Then you can perform additional computation on that data, throw a machine learning algorithm on top to start to identify patterns or correlations. And that's an ability that would be impossible today at scale. And so, there are a million use cases for how having individual control over longitudinal data can allow for us to derive new insights about population health, derive insights about how a particular condition is expressed in a single patient. And so I think in terms of playing nicely with the existing landscape and more on the enterprise side, blockchain is going to be an enabler of efficiency. But I think on the patient care side, it can really be disruptive in terms of what outcomes are possible and the way that we perform care.
I think the most exciting use cases are solving old problems in new ways. And so that's where that point I was trying to make earlier around, you got this tech, and this tech enables you to think of a new business model to solve an age-old problem. And that's what that 20% of GDP is a third of waste, administrative burden, pricing problems, is stuff that's really hard to fix based on our current digital infrastructure. And so you can apply new business models. So at Hashed, I'll give you some examples. At Hashed, we think a lot about exchanges because it's kind of a proven blockchain business model, right? So the traditional way of solving credentialing is centralized aggregation of a database, do the best you can, and then sell that information to people who need it. What we built with Procredits is like a new rail, a new digital highway for people to move, for people who have those artifacts, those physician credentialing artifacts. People who have them can now move them on this new highway to people who need them, right? So we've created an exchange where you're trading these artifacts, basically. So that's a new business model applied to an old problem on top of the blockchain. And Bramble is very similar. It's an NFT exchange, non-fungible tokens, where the token represents a healthcare service. So a doctor, location, terms and conditions, a service description, and a price. And that's the non-fungible token that's traded on an exchange to people who want to buy services in a new way. So these are examples of how blockchain enables you to think differently about the business model that you're trying to use to tackle an old problem.
So I'll echo what you both said, that the current healthcare system and the infrastructure and the technology isn't going away. And it's taken me a long time to come to terms with that, because I think we all wish it would. But it isn't. So there's years of efficiency gains that we could get, and a lot of good work that could be done there, again, to take that capital, to free up that capital so it could be deployed elsewhere. But simultaneously, you'll see blockchain coming into new applications to solve problems that we're only just beginning to realize we have. So let me give you an example that goes back to my first point about how blockchain works better when it works with friends, right? So now we have a notion of you're in a hospital and you're connected to infusion pumps and monitors and dialysis machines and whatnot, and these are all connected. These are all connected devices. They're IoT devices. They connect up into the cloud. They're controlled increasingly more centrally. And what does that mean? That means that they're accessible to hackers. So we now have a new terrifying problem called therapeutic intervention attacks, where people can take over or manipulate nefariously a drug infusion pump, which is the thing that pumps medicine into your arm if you're in a hospital, right? They could take it over and use it to cause harm. So how frightening is that, right? This is a problem of the connected age. Blockchain is one possible solution to it, to defend against these type of attacks, right? So that's a very different example of a new business model or a new way of using blockchain and IoT together to solve an emerging problem.
And what's really cool is then you give that infusion pump a wallet, and you allow that infusion pump to start talking to other infusion pumps, and they all kind of start collaborating together. So these machine-to-machine things that you can start doing on top of IoT is like a really, really far-out, awesome thing to sit and drink some beers with a friend and talk about.
And they'll each have a Facebook page.
So you not only have you created new marketplaces and new exchanges and new business models, but you've created new actors on those exchanges and in those business models that can execute transactions and move value around. And it just, it's the convergence, like Mark said, it's the convergence of blockchain and IoT, convergence of blockchain and AI and machine learning that really starts to light your brain up with cool ideas. But I got to take it back to, we got to start easy and simple first. Simpler the better.
All right, you've been dying to ask a question.
Yeah, so I've been hearing a lot about longitudinal health records and how you have all these connected devices and all this connected data. You're going to be able to run AI on it, and you're going to be able to, derive new insights. But how do you fix the usability problem, the user experience problem? Patients are, as of right now, only, I think New Hampshire is the only state where patient actually owns their health records. And, in 20 other states, providers own the health records. So the providers are usually the ones that are going to be, owning the records in their system. So if you want a patient to authorize the transfer of data or authorize a certain operation on their data, most patients are not familiar with that kind of thinking or that kind of model, and they don't know how to do that. Older patients in particular, a lot of them don't even know how to use a computer or an iPhone or a smartphone. So how would you address that in terms of UX?
So are any of you guys app developers? Would you consider yourselves app developers? This is your problem. No, seriously though, this is a design question, right? How do we create experiences that enable all of these wonderful benefits we're describing, but have an onboarding process that is not prohibitive? So the way we think about it at Linnia is that we are on the protocol layer and we enable user-facing applications to engage with Web3. We sort of joke about it. It's like Web 3.0 in a repo, right? You engage with the protocol, and then it allows you to leverage all of the benefits of decentralization, individual permissioning, et cetera. But the question is still, as you've articulated, at that moment of onboarding, how do you provide an interaction for a user that allows them to derive the benefits of all of the, the sort of complex technology through a very simple interface? And so I think, you can't boil the ocean, right? So the first solutions that achieve user engagement and straightforward user onboarding likely will not be, a complete picture of your longitudinal health record and providing informed consent for procedures and, medical studies and, and make you breakfast and all of that, right? It's a question of, what is the most narrow scope of a user onboarding experience enabled by blockchain that can then be used as an indicator of future scale. So right now, some of the use cases that we're working on involve one of my favorite things, fantasy football. What if there was a way for players to have control over their physical data, their health data, maybe their sleep data or nutrition training regimen? And what if they then were enabled or empowered to not only own and control that data, but permission it out such that third parties like individual fantasy players, leagues, Vegas houses could compensate them for access to portions of that data. So that's a pretty narrow use case. It deals with health data. And it requires a very simple onboarding process because, just like my grandmother, Tom Brady is not going to spend a lot of time dealing with his app interface to figure out how to make it work. And so I think sort of the long answer to your short question is we can look to onboarding experiences both in and out of the blockchain space to derive UX that solves for this problem. And it's going to require a lot of creativity and a lot of good design work and our app developer in the back.
I think the road is littered in bodies of companies who've tried to build longitudinal health records. And I mean, blockchain is here, but what's really changed in terms of the consumer's desire to adopt and hold that information in a wallet? So I think there's still a lot of questions around. I think it's a great use case and it solves problems, especially in pockets of individuals and people who have a sick kid or have some complex comorbidities or travel a lot with complex. There's certain use cases, but I think I count myself maybe fortunate that I don't walk around every day wishing I had my medical record on my phone, and I think there are a lot of people like that. And so I think there is a little bit of a disconnect between everyone's favorite use case, which is medical records on your cell phone, and the realities of a lot of consumers out there. And so it is a design issue, and there's all these use cases have design issues, but there's also I need to go back and study the failures of the past by all these big companies who've had great efforts and spent a ton of money on longitudinal health record activity.
Yeah, so I do a lot of. I mean, my background has been mostly design-centered product development, and we've worked with a healthcare provider who actually has access to a lot of our records, and we were trying to find specific use cases for why someone would download an app to provide consent to hand over their medical information to life science providers who pay really good money to recruit a patient for purposes of clinical trials, right? Upwards of tens of thousands of dollars per patient being recruited, depending on what's being tested. But we focus first on those who are really engaged in their health, chronic illnesses, rare diseases, right? And we ask them, do you care about your medical records? Do you care about having access to your medical records? They do. They have access to them. The access to them is really clunky in most of these, and they have 5 different providers in different systems. So they have to go to the websites for each of those and pull them down and extract them, and it's really. And chronic illness patients, the elderly, as you mentioned, a lot of times they don't know how to use the computer, so they end up placing a lot of phone calls and maybe eventually get, sent in the mail. But what we realized in that situation, then you have to go to the care provider, right? And the care provider who has more or less either the GP or someone who's actually offering in-home care, and you get them to actually onboard the use case. But chronic illnesses people are engaged in their health. Most of the people I look at the faces around this room, what's going to motivate us to take the extra 30, 45 seconds to download an app and continually engage in on a regular basis? That's really tough. You have to really find out specific use cases. Diabetes may be a great use case because there's a community built around diabetes, right? Chronic illnesses, and then the list goes on and on. That's the great thing about healthcare is that there's no lack of use cases. The problem is what are the first use cases that gained adoption?
Maternal health, like pregnant women are like the sweet spot for like constant engagement. There's a lot of great companies that have done that, not on a blockchain.
I'll give you an example of how we're tackling that in a slightly different way. So we acknowledging everything that you said and the panel said, we went about it in a slightly different way. We looked at starting with a very simple mechanism. It's called eClipboard. So if you're within a health plan and you get referred from your primary care doctor to a specialist, let's say, you walk into that person's office, you get handed a clipboard. Right? Why? It's part of the same provider network. So now what we're doing, one of the projects we're working on, is to incorporate that, giving consent to release some basic core of medical data and personal information when the patient makes the appointment. So you have a referral, you go on to the provider network site to find, let's say, an orthopedist who's in your network. You make the appointment through their scheduling tool, and that's when you give consent. You give consent, you don't see your entire health record, you just say, do you want something like, do you want your information shared with this provider? And what happens then is you walk into the office, no app involved, not at this point. You identify yourself, verify your identity, and that provider has all of your information already. They have all of your information already. And one of the things that does is the true economic benefit of it, in addition to an improved patient experience, is, let's say you had an x-ray 2 weeks ago. If that provider, that orthopedist can't get access to that x-ray, they'll just order another one, right? And that's a real cost, it's a waste. So through this, the metric that we're looking at, in addition to member satisfaction, is that we reduce these unnecessary duplicate procedures.
Yes.
I want to ask a question on scalability. This really goes down to the lower layers. There's a lot of dynamism in the protocols and the blockchains, and I'm specifically focused on the energy consumption of proof of work in public blockchains, and that's considered to be a barrier, especially if you can't mine with any kind of profit in the US because the energy costs are too high. So all the mining centralized in a place where a 51% attack could be done by the government today. So are we going to cross a chasm of technology? I know, there's all this talk about moving to the state. Do we need something that doesn't exist today in order to realize the moonshot of a longitudinal health record or a highly scalable system? I assume it's going to be a public blockchain. I'll scale, and then I'll stop.
Sure.
I would say in healthcare today, in the short and medium term, it's a private permission blockchain, not a public blockchain. Because of the security, which remember we're talking about big enterprises, but also because private information equals fast and efficient. And so we don't have the private permission network, the energy consumption, the consumptiveness is orders of magnitude lower. Right, so if we talk about expanding this to all of healthcare for all of the drug supply chain, we'd be processing billions of transactions a year. Right? In a public network that could conceivably use more power than the United Kingdom, right? Which wouldn't be sustainable. And the big companies that stand behind this would impact their corporate social responsibility metrics. Right? If they're using that much power to power core IT infrastructure. So I think private permission in the near term is the way to go.
How is that not like today's EHRs? Or don't they get fragmented down?
No, because the private permission just means a known set of participants. So you use blockchain as a key ring to hold the keys to all the EHRs. So it allows them to come together, but they're behind a private permission wall, so there's a greater sense of security and trust.
So if you talk about a comparison to the systems that we have today, Epic and others, right? You have to think about, is it really an apples to apples comparison between the status quo and a blockchain-based environment, private and permissioned or public, right? And then we have to sort of step back and ask the question, what are we actually trying to achieve with electronic health records, right? Is Epic really working really well for us? Is all of the information stored in Epic relevant to patient health and outcomes? No, the majority of it is relative to medical billing and what room you were treated in. It has nothing to do with patient outcomes. And so in that way, I would say it's not an apples to apples comparison of energy consumption. It's a question of, are the systems we are choosing really serving the objectives we have in this industry? And then I would also say, just generally, if we want to sort of talk about public chain mining energy consumption, yeah, it's a huge challenge, and it will continue to be a prohibitive challenge if we assume that technological development stops and does not progress from this moment forward, right? And so I think your note that we may be relying on technologies that don't yet exist today to scale, that is absolutely true. And for those of you guys who are involved in or aware of the roadmap for platforms like Ethereum, things like a two-factor approach and sharding and plasma and off-chain storage and on-chain hashing all offer various different approaches for how we can address energy consumption. But at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what are we actually trying to accomplish? Are we trying to minimize energy consumption, or are we trying to improve health outcomes?
Okay, so one last question that can be answered in 30 seconds. Huh? No? No, I'm going to be honest. Can't do it. All right, go ahead.
I don't know if it'll be 30 seconds, but basically, so I totally see how we can reduce some of the wasteful spending and that big chunk of GDP that we spend on healthcare using some of these use cases, but we're not there on the user side, and like we were talking about, there's a lot of work we have to work very closely with current entities like the payers and the providers. But these people have been doing business the same way for 60, 100 years. How are we going to, what are some strategies to drive adoption of this blockchain technology when doctors are still using paper charts?
Okay, let's take a question. Everyone, closing thoughts. How do we drive adoption? I think it's a great place to end. More broadly, I know you have a more nuanced question, but how do we get this going?
10-second answer is start with simple use cases, demonstrate, solve a real problem, probably a B2B problem in the short term, and then expand and iterate beyond that.
If you have ideas for use cases and any software engineering background, come talk to me. I'll hire you. Seriously, I'm hiring. Come talk to me afterwards.
We're all hiring.
Yeah, we're all hiring.
That's great. Don't just talk to her.
I would ditto what they said. Let's start small bites, chew quickly. But then also, what's going to be the driver of this is the change in corporate control that we're seeing. These radical shifts in the industry.
Yep.
Amazon, if they enter the healthcare industry, they're not going to give a shit about how it was done 80 years ago, right? They're going to come up with some new way of doing it, right? And that's an opportunity.
We have the opportunity to redesign the value chains and the market structures underneath the feet of the Fortune 500 companies in healthcare. And so that's going to happen in 5 to 10 year time frame, probably. Maybe a little bit longer. Some use cases maybe a little shorter. But that's the opportunity that you guys have coming out of Wharton or wherever you are.
You are the future.
So that's a pretty exciting thing.
The answer is in yourself. You heard it here.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Please join me.